"Mom, please don't go in there, you'll embarrass her," Daniel said, blocking the entrance to the ballroom as if he were speaking about the weather instead of his own mother, and Margaret Whitmore stood very still beneath the soft glow of the hotel's crystal chandelier, the gift bag hanging from her wrist, the tissue paper trembling slightly from the air conditioning that felt far colder than it should have in early May. She had driven 42 miles that afternoon in her silver sedan, the one Daniel had once insisted was too old but she kept because it was paid off and reliable, and she had taken extra care choosing her navy dress, the one with the modest lace sleeves that Emily had once said made her look elegant, grandma, back when compliments were still simple and sincere. The ballroom doors behind Daniel were open just enough for Margaret to hear the bass from the DJ, the laughter of teenagers dressed in glittering gowns and tailored suits, the kind of celebration that marked the official crossing into adulthood, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine Emily inside, radiant in pale blue, smiling wide, unaware that her grandmother was being assessed like a liability at the threshold. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The embarrassment was delivered in a whisper. "It's just this is her night. We don't want any awkward moments." Margaret nodded slowly, as if he had told her the cake flavor had changed or the schedule had shifted, something ordinary and harmless, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't the first time she had been gently repositioned outside the frame. She remembered the Christmas 3 years ago when plans had been simplified, the graduation dinner where seating had been limited, the family photos that appeared online with everyone smiling except for the one person who hadn't been invited. She had always chosen grace over confrontation, believing dignity would outlast discomfort, but standing there in the polished marble lobby of the Fairmont Grand, watching her son guard a doorway that led to her own granddaughter's milestone, she understood something had shifted from oversight to intention. "I brought her something," she said quietly, lifting the small ivory envelope nestled inside the gift bag, though she didn't elaborate on its contents. Daniel glanced at it without curiosity. "You can give it to her later," he replied, already half turned toward the music, toward the applause that suddenly erupted inside as if on cue. Margaret studied his profile, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when she used to pack his school lunches and remind him to bring a sweater, and she realized he was not angry, not cruel in an obvious way, just resolved. Resolved that her presence was a risk to the image he preferred. The valet outside opened the lobby doors for a group of guests arriving in a stretch limousine, their laughter bright and effortless, and Margaret stepped back from the threshold before anyone inside could notice the pause, the hesitation, the quiet negotiation taking place. She smoothed the front of her dress, adjusted the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, and gave Daniel a small, steady smile that did not ask for reconsideration. "Of course," she said, as if this had always been the plan. Then she turned away from the ballroom, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor, and walked toward the exit with the same composed posture she had carried through 72 years of birthdays, weddings and funerals, except this time, as the automatic doors slid open and the evening air met her face, she understood that the gift she carried would not be handed over the way anyone expected. Margaret did not start the engine right away. She sat behind the steering wheel with both hands resting lightly at 10 and 2, the way she had been taught in driver education decades ago, and watched families stream into the hotel beneath strings of white lights that fluttered in the evening breeze, mothers adjusting corsages, fathers checking their watches, young women stepping carefully in high heels that clicked confidently against the pavement, and she allowed herself one steady breath before placing the gift bag on the passenger seat beside her as though it were another quiet companion. The tissue paper had settled now, no longer trembling, and she smoothed it once more out of habit, noticing how carefully she had wrapped everything that morning at her dining room table, measuring the ribbon, pressing the folds flat, writing Emily's name in slow, deliberate script across the ivory envelope because handwriting, she believed, still mattered in a world that moved too quickly for reflection. The drive back home took just under an hour, the highway stretching ahead in long silver lanes, and the radio remained off because silence felt more honest than music. She thought about the first birthday she had ever planned for Daniel, how she had saved for weeks to buy a small train set from a department store that no longer existed, how she had baked the cake herself in a modest kitchen that smelled of vanilla and warm butter, and how he had once run into her arms without hesitation when he saw her at the edge of a room. The memory did not sting the way it might have years ago. Instead, it settled into place like another piece of evidence in a quiet, ongoing calculation. When she pulled into her driveway, the porch light flickered on automatically, illuminating the flower bed she tended every spring, and she carried the gift bag inside with the same composed posture she had worn in the hotel lobby. The house greeted her with familiar stillness, the clock above the stove ticking evenly, the framed photographs along the hallway reflecting the soft lamplight, images of graduations and vacations and smiles that once felt unshakable. She set the gift bag on the kitchen counter and removed the envelope, turning it over in her hands as if weighing something far heavier than paper. Inside was more than a sentimental note. It was documentation, carefully prepared weeks earlier with the guidance of her attorney, outlining the education trust she had established for Emily when she was just 8 years old, funded quietly over time, every dividend reinvested, every contribution made without announcement or applause. Margaret had believed that adulthood should begin with opportunity, not obligation, and she had chosen 18 as the moment to explain that gift in person, to look her granddaughter in the eye and say that independence came with both support and responsibility. Instead, she stood alone in her kitchen, the overhead light humming softly, and realized that the envelope represented something else now. It was not simply financial assistance. It was a measure of access, of trust, of who was permitted into the circle and who was kept at the doorway. She poured herself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed the envelope back inside the bag with deliberate care. Then she reached for the phone on the counter, scrolled to a familiar number labeled only as Attorney Collins, and let it ring once before ending the call, deciding that there was no need for urgency, only precision. Some decisions, she understood, were stronger when made without witnesses, and tonight had offered her more clarity than any argument ever could. Margaret slept only a few hours that night, not because she was restless, but because clarity has a way of arriving before dawn and refusing to leave. When the first pale light filtered through the kitchen curtains, she was already seated at the small oak table with a legal pad in front of her, her reading glasses balanced low on her nose, the gift bag resting within arm's reach like an unopened chapter. She poured herself black coffee, measured carefully, no sugar, no cream, and listened to the steady hum of the refrigerator as if it were keeping time with her thoughts. She did not replay the moment at the ballroom door the way someone wounded might. Instead, she examined it with quiet precision, the tone in Daniel's voice, the absence of hesitation, the way he had positioned himself slightly sideways to block her view inside, protective not of his daughter's feelings but of the image he believed he was curating. Margaret had spent decades understanding the difference between protection and control. By 9 o'clock she had showered, dressed in a simple gray cardigan and pressed slacks, and placed the envelope into her leather handbag. She drove 20 minutes into town to the brick office building where Attorney Collins practiced, the same office where she had first drafted the education trust 10 years earlier, when Emily still wore her hair in pigtails and asked endless questions about how banks worked. The waiting room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper, and Margaret sat with her ankles crossed, posture upright, not as a woman seeking comfort but as one reviewing a contract with her own expectations. When she was invited inside, she did not dramatize the previous evening. She simply stated that circumstances had changed, and that she wished to amend the terms of the trust before any distributions were made. Attorney Collins listened carefully, pen poised above a legal pad, asking measured questions about intent and timing. Margaret explained that the fund was established to support character as much as education, and that access required more than a shared last name. There was no anger in her voice, only deliberation. She authorized a temporary hold on the account, instructing that no funds be released without her written approval, and then inquired about alternative beneficiaries, including scholarship programs for local students who demonstrated both academic merit and financial need. The conversation was professional, contained, almost ordinary, and when she signed the preliminary amendment forms, her signature did not tremble. Outside, the late morning sun had warmed the sidewalk, and Margaret paused beside her car for a moment, feeling neither triumphant nor defeated. She felt balanced. Back at home, her phone displayed several notifications from social media, photographs of the celebration uploaded overnight, captions filled with exclamation points and filtered light. She scrolled once, then set the phone face down on the counter. Image she knew was temporary. Structure lasted longer. She placed the amended documents in a drawer beside her desk, aligned neatly with past records, and began preparing lunch for herself, slicing tomatoes with steady hands, aware that decisions made in silence often carried the most enduring echo. The afternoon after her meeting with Attorney Collins unfolded with a kind of quiet order that Margaret had always trusted more than apologies, and she moved through her home with deliberate calm, watering the hydrangeas along the walkway, folding a load of laundry, placing each towel into neat thirds as if symmetry itself were a form of reassurance. By early evening her phone rang, Daniel's name appearing on the screen, and she let it ring twice before answering, not to create drama but because she refused to rush toward a conversation that had not been offered to her with respect the night before. His voice sounded lighter than she expected, buoyed by the afterglow of celebration. He mentioned how beautiful everything had been, how Emily had cried during her speech, how the photographs were already circulating among relatives, and then, almost as an afterthought, he said that Emily had asked whether her grandmother had been feeling unwell. Margaret listened without interruption, picturing the ballroom she had not entered, the candles, the applause, the illusion of completeness. She replied that she had been perfectly well, and that she hoped the evening had been meaningful. There was a pause on the line, subtle but present, and Daniel shifted his tone, explaining that he had only been trying to prevent unnecessary tension, that teenage events could be unpredictable, that he wanted to avoid any scene that might distract from the focus of the night. Margaret acknowledged his words without validating them, because she understood that justification often arrives dressed as concern. After the call ended she sat at her desk and opened the small wooden box where she kept documents that mattered: birth certificates, insurance policies, the original trust agreement drafted 10 years earlier. She traced her finger along the embossed seal on the folder, and remembered the day she had funded the account with the first $20,000, selling a parcel of land she had inherited, believing that legacy meant preparation rather than control. She had not created the trust to purchase gratitude, nor to secure invitations, but she had expected a baseline of inclusion, the simple courtesy of being seen as part of the family story. Later that evening, Emily sent a brief text message, a photograph of herself in a pale blue gown, smiling beneath a cascade of gold balloons, followed by a single line thanking her grandmother for always being supportive. Margaret studied the image carefully, noticing the sincerity in her granddaughter's eyes, the youth, the possibility that she might not yet understand the dynamics operating around her. Margaret replied with equal brevity, telling Emily that she looked radiant and that adulthood was not defined by a single night, but by the choices that followed. She placed the phone down and returned to the folder, sliding the amended documents beside the originals with methodical care. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening stillness, porch lights flickering on one by one, and Margaret felt no surge of anger, no dramatic resolve, only a growing certainty that boundaries were not punishments but structures. In the quiet of her living room, she realized that the decision she had set in motion was less about withholding a gift and more about redefining access, about ensuring that any future generosity would rest on mutual regard rather than silent dismissal. 2 days later the shift arrived not as an argument but as a knock at Margaret's front door just after 3 in the afternoon, the kind of tentative knock that suggests hesitation rather than entitlement, and when she opened it she found Emily standing on the porch in jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, no glitter, no balloons, no background music to amplify the moment. Margaret stepped aside without surprise, as though she had anticipated that clarity would eventually travel the 42 miles between them, and invited her granddaughter inside where sunlight filtered through the living room curtains and settled gently across the polished wood floors. Emily sat at the edge of the sofa, hands folded tightly in her lap, and looked younger than she had in the photographs from the celebration, less curated, more uncertain. She explained that she had only learned that morning her grandmother had not stayed for the party, that her father had mentioned something vague about timing, and that something about the explanation had not aligned with what she felt when she noticed the empty chair reserved for family. Margaret listened without interrupting, noticing the sincerity in the young woman's voice, the slight tremor that comes not from fear but from recognition that a boundary may have been crossed without consent. When Emily asked directly whether she had done something wrong, Margaret shook her head with calm precision, and told her that adulthood was not a single event marked by music and speeches, but a series of moments when one chooses whether to remain silent or to seek understanding. She retrieved the ivory envelope from her desk and placed it on the coffee table between them, not sliding it forward, not dramatizing its presence, simply allowing it to exist in the open air. She explained that the education trust had been created years earlier, funded quietly and consistently, because she believed opportunity should be prepared long before it is requested. Emily's eyes widened with surprise, gratitude flickering briefly before confusion followed when Margaret described the recent amendment that placed a temporary hold on its distribution. There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity as she explained that financial support carries meaning beyond dollars, and that inclusion is measured not by photographs but by respect. Emily absorbed the words slowly, glancing toward the envelope as though it contained both promise and consequence. She admitted that she had sensed tension over the years, small adjustments in seating arrangements, comments framed as practicality, and that she had not always understood their weight. Margaret did not criticize Daniel or Claire. She simply stated that structures must reflect values, and that any gift she extended would align with mutual regard, rather than convenience. The room remained quiet for several seconds, the ticking clock above the mantel marking time evenly, and then Emily nodded, not in agreement with every decision but in recognition of its reasoning. When she finally stood to leave, she thanked her grandmother not for the money but for the honesty, and Margaret watched her walk down the driveway with a posture that seemed slightly more grounded than before. Inside, the envelope remained unopened on the coffee table, and Margaret felt neither regret nor triumph, only the steady understanding that dignity, once reclaimed, does not require applause to remain intact. The morning after Emily's visit unfolded with a subtle shift in the air, the kind that follows an honest conversation rather than a confrontation, and Margaret rose early as she always did, tying her robe at the waist and stepping onto the back patio with a cup of warm tea while the neighborhood remained quiet except for the distant hum of traffic beginning to build along the highway. She replayed her granddaughter's expression from the day before, not searching for weakness but measuring growth, recognizing that understanding often arrives in layers rather than declarations. By 10 o'clock her phone rang again, this time Daniel's voice less buoyant than it had been earlier in the week. He mentioned that Emily had stopped by his office that morning with questions about the trust fund, about paperwork, about why her grandmother had chosen to place it on hold, and there was a strain beneath his words that had not been present before. Margaret did not respond defensively. She explained in steady tones that the trust had been established long ago as an investment in character and education, not as a reward for appearance or a tool for negotiation, and that recent events had required reflection. Daniel shifted from surprise to irritation, suggesting that decisions involving his daughter should include him, that financial matters within a family ought to be transparent. Margaret allowed the silence between them to stretch just long enough to remind him that transparency works in more than one direction. She reminded him gently that she had not been granted transparency at the ballroom door, nor offered inclusion in the planning of a milestone celebration. There was no accusation in her delivery, only symmetry. After the call ended, she opened her laptop and reviewed the amended documents once more, confirming that the temporary hold would remain in place until further notice. She then drafted a brief letter to Attorney Collins outlining her intention to explore converting a portion of the trust into a community scholarship fund in Emily's name, contingent upon her granddaughter's expressed values and future conduct. It was not a punishment, it was a recalibration. Later that afternoon, Claire sent a polite but carefully worded message expressing confusion and emphasizing that emotions had been high during the party preparations. Margaret read it twice before replying with equal courtesy, stating that emotions often reveal priorities, and that she believed in structures that support mutual respect. As the sun lowered behind the trees lining her backyard, Margaret felt no urgency to defend herself. She prepared dinner for one, placing a single plate at the kitchen table, aware that solitude chosen differs greatly from solitude imposed. The envelope remained on her desk, unopened but no longer heavy, and she understood that whatever direction the trust ultimately took would not be determined by pressure or guilt but by alignment. In the quiet of her home, she recognized that influence does not require volume, and that the most enduring lessons are often delivered without raising one's voice at all. The following week unfolded with a calm that felt almost deceptive, as though the household tensions had been folded neatly out of sight, and Margaret continued her routines without alteration, attending her Thursday book club at the local library, stopping by the farmer's market for fresh peaches, and maintaining the steady cadence of a life built on structure rather than reaction. Yet beneath that steadiness, movement was occurring. Emily called midweek, her voice thoughtful rather than distressed, asking whether she could meet again to better understand what the trust represented beyond tuition payments and dormitory deposits. Margaret suggested they walk together through the small botanical garden near her home, a place where conversations tended to stretch naturally without interruption. They met beneath the tall maple trees, sunlight filtering through leaves that had just begun to hint at autumn, and as they walked along the gravel path, Margaret explained how financial support is often mistaken for affection, when in truth, it is a reflection of responsibility. She told Emily that the fund was never intended as leverage, nor as a silent contract demanding gratitude, but as an extension of belief in her potential. Emily listened closely, admitting that she had grown accustomed to curated events, polished presentations, and the quiet assumption that grandparents existed in the background, dependable but peripheral. The admission was not cruel, merely honest. Margaret appreciated that honesty more than any apology rehearsed under pressure. Meanwhile, Daniel grew increasingly aware that the amended trust was not a temporary mood, but a deliberate adjustment, and he requested a meeting at Margaret's home that weekend. When he arrived with Claire, the atmosphere was restrained but not hostile. Margaret served coffee in simple white mugs, and invited them to sit at the dining table where many earlier family conversations had unfolded under different circumstances. Daniel expressed concern that Emily's educational plans might be affected, that uncertainty could create unnecessary stress. Margaret responded with measured clarity, explaining that uncertainty often reveals values more clearly than comfort does. She outlined the possibility of converting part of the fund into a scholarship administered independently, ensuring that Emily could still benefit if she demonstrated initiative and accountability separate from parental mediation. Claire attempted to soften the discussion by referencing the pressures of hosting a milestone event, suggesting that miscommunication had been amplified by logistics. Margaret acknowledged the complexity of large gatherings, but reiterated that exclusion is rarely accidental when it repeats. The conversation remained controlled. No raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, only a gradual recognition that influence had shifted. By the time Daniel and Claire departed, it was clear that Margaret's decisions would not be reversed through persuasion alone. That evening she sat at her desk once more, reviewing draft language for the scholarship proposal, considering criteria that emphasized community service and independent application essays. She felt neither hardened nor vindicated, only aligned. In the quiet rhythm of her pen moving across paper, she understood that legacy is not defined by attendance at a single celebration, but by the standards one chooses to uphold long after the music fades. In the weeks that followed, the energy within the family adjusted in ways that could not be captured in photographs or filtered captions, and Margaret continued her routines with the same steady composure, though those around her began to recognize that steadiness as resolve rather than passivity. Emily submitted a thoughtful outline to her grandmother describing how she intended to pursue a degree in environmental science, including volunteer hours she had recently begun logging at a local conservation center, and she asked whether initiative might matter more than expectation. Margaret read the document twice at her dining room table, appreciating not the ambition alone but the independent effort it represented. She replied with measured encouragement, explaining that responsibility demonstrated voluntarily carries more weight than responsibility assumed. Meanwhile, Daniel noticed that conversations about money no longer unfolded casually at family gatherings, because there were no gatherings. Invitations became deliberate rather than automatic, and silence settled into spaces where assumptions once lived. Claire maintained a courteous tone in occasional messages, emphasizing unity and shared goals. Yet the underlying dynamic had shifted in subtle, but undeniable ways. Margaret met once more with Attorney Collins and finalized the revised structure of the trust, allocating a significant portion to a community scholarship fund that would require applicants, including Emily, to complete essays and interviews assessed by an independent committee. It was not exclusion, it was accountability formalized. When the paperwork was complete, Margaret drove home beneath a sky streaked with late summer clouds, aware that the outcome would not be universally celebrated but confident that clarity rarely is. That evening Emily called again, her voice steady, saying she wished to apply not because she felt entitled but because she wished to earn the opportunity. Margaret listened carefully, hearing growth where once there had been assumption, and told her granddaughter that adulthood is defined less by the parties one attends and more by the standards one upholds afterward. After the call ended, Margaret stepped onto her back porch as dusk settled across the yard, the air warm and quiet, and she felt neither vindicated nor wounded. She understood that dignity, once asserted calmly, does not require repetition. The house behind her remained still, her documents aligned in their drawer, her decisions intact, and she recognized that legacy is shaped not by who stands at a ballroom doorway, but by who chooses to walk forward with integrity once the doors have closed. Autumn arrived with a steadier chill in the air, and Margaret noticed the change in small details, the way the maple leaves along her street deepened into shades of amber, the way sunlight angled lower across her kitchen floor in the late afternoon, and with the change of season came a shift in the tone of conversations that could no longer be avoided. Emily submitted her scholarship application formally, complete with an essay that spoke not only of environmental science, but of accountability, of learning to examine one's own assumptions before examining the world. And when Margaret read the final paragraph, she recognized that the young woman was beginning to separate celebration from character. The independent committee, assembled through Attorney Collins's office, reviewed applications over the course of several weeks, and Margaret remained intentionally distant from the deliberations, insisting that integrity required her to relinquish direct influence. Daniel, however, struggled with the transformation of what he had once considered a private family matter into a structured evaluation process, and he requested another conversation, this time without Claire present. They met at a quiet cafe halfway between their homes, the kind with wooden tables and soft background music that does not interfere with conversation, and Daniel admitted that he had underestimated the weight of that evening at the hotel, that he had mistaken image management for protection. Margaret listened carefully, stirring her tea slowly, and responded that exclusion, even when politely delivered, leaves a record. She did not accuse him of malice. She spoke instead of patterns, of how small decisions accumulate until they redefine relationships. Daniel asked whether the trust would ever return to its original form, and Margaret answered that trust, whether financial or personal, is dynamic and must adapt to demonstrated values. She explained that the scholarship decision would reflect Emily's effort, not parental expectation, and that her role was no longer to quietly fund appearances, but to support substance. The conversation remained calm, measured, and when they parted there was no dramatic reconciliation, only an acknowledgement that clarity had replaced assumption. Later that week the committee announced that Emily had been selected as one of the scholarship recipients based on her essay and volunteer record, not by default but by merit, and when Margaret received the official notice she allowed herself a small private smile. She understood that the outcome carried more meaning than any envelope exchanged at a doorway ever could, and as she placed the letter carefully into her desk drawer, she recognized that respect earned through process endures longer than respect granted through convenience. The announcement of the scholarship decision did not arrive with applause or dramatic confrontation. It arrived as a formal letter bearing the seal of the independent committee, and Margaret read it at her dining table with the same composed posture she had maintained through every stage of the process. Emily had been awarded funding based on merit, her essay noted for its reflection on responsibility and growth, and Margaret felt a quiet confirmation that structure had accomplished what sentiment alone could not. Later that afternoon Emily came by once more, not with uncertainty this time but with gratitude expressed carefully, as though she understood that the recognition she had received carried weight beyond tuition payments. She thanked her grandmother not simply for establishing the fund but for insisting that she earn it, admitting that the experience had forced her to examine assumptions she had absorbed without question. Margaret listened and responded that adulthood is not measured by age but by accountability, and that opportunity secured through effort strengthens character in ways convenience never can. Daniel called that evening, his tone markedly different from earlier conversations, acknowledging that the scholarship outcome had shifted his perspective. He admitted that he had conflated protection with control, and that he had underestimated how exclusion, even when politely phrased, reshapes trust. Margaret did not press him for apology. She recognized that awareness itself is often the beginning of repair. She reminded him that family is sustained not by curated images or perfectly orchestrated events, but by mutual regard demonstrated consistently over time. In the weeks that followed, invitations became direct rather than implied, conversations more measured, and while the past could not be rewritten, The present carried a clearer understanding of boundaries. Margaret continued her routines without flourish, tending her garden, meeting friends for coffee, reviewing community scholarship applications as they arrived, and she noticed that her influence now rested not on silent generosity, but on articulated values. One evening as she organized paperwork in her study, she paused briefly, recalling the moment at the ballroom doorway that had once felt like dismissal, and she realized that it had instead become a pivot point. By insisting on respect without raising her voice, she had redefined her role within the family. She closed the file drawer gently and turned off the desk lamp, aware that legacy is not secured through presence alone, but through principles upheld calmly, even when doors appear to close. Winter approached gradually, and with it came a steadier rhythm within the Whitmore family, not dramatic or sentimental, but grounded in quiet adjustments that revealed more than apologies ever could. Margaret noticed that invitations now arrived with direct phone calls, rather than forwarded messages, that dates were confirmed rather than assumed, and that her presence was requested without qualification. When Emily received her official university acceptance letter in early December, she chose to share the news first in her grandmother's kitchen rather than on social media, placing the envelope on the table with hands that trembled slightly from excitement rather than uncertainty. Margaret read the letter carefully, tracing each printed line with composed attention, and congratulated her granddaughter not for the destination alone but for the effort that had carried her there. Daniel arrived later that evening, bringing a small bouquet of white lilies, an understated gesture that spoke more clearly than elaborate explanations. He acknowledged that the past months had reshaped his understanding of leadership within a family, that shielding someone from discomfort can sometimes create deeper fractures than honesty ever would. Margaret listened without interruption, recognizing that growth in others often requires patience rather than pressure. She did not revisit the ballroom doorway or the words spoken there. She understood that repeating a wound does not heal it. Instead, she outlined her expectations moving forward with simple clarity, emphasizing that respect must be demonstrated consistently, and that generosity is most meaningful when paired with acknowledgement. Claire's tone softened over subsequent weeks, her messages reflecting collaboration rather than control, and while the transformation was not sudden, it was observable. Margaret continued overseeing the scholarship committee with impartial diligence, reviewing essays from students she had never met, ensuring that the fund she had created would outlast any single family disagreement. One quiet evening as she organized holiday cards on her desk, she paused to reflect not on what had been taken from her, but on what she had preserved. Dignity, she understood, is maintained not through confrontation but through steady alignment with one's values. The house felt warm despite the cold outside, the lights from neighboring homes glowing softly through bare branches, and Margaret recognized that her role had evolved from silent supporter to intentional steward. In that evolution there was no triumph, only balance, and she allowed herself a small, satisfied breath before sealing the final envelope of the night, confident that the standard she upheld would continue to guide every threshold she approached in the future. Spring returned with a softness that felt almost deliberate, as if the season itself understood the difference between noise and renewal, and Margaret stood at her kitchen window one morning watching the first green shoots push through the soil along the edge of her garden beds. The months since that evening at the hotel had not erased what had happened, but they had reshaped its meaning. Emily now stopped by regularly, sometimes to review scholarship paperwork, sometimes simply to sit at the table with a cup of tea and discuss college housing options measured in square footage and shared kitchens rather than ballroom decor. Their conversations were no longer shadowed by assumption. They were direct, grounded, and quietly respectful. Daniel had grown more measured as well. He no longer filtered invitations through convenience or presentation. When he asked whether she would attend a small family dinner to celebrate Emily's final decision on a university, he did so plainly, without qualifiers. Margaret agreed just as plainly. There were no speeches that night, no orchestrated photographs intended to project harmony. There was conversation, simple and steady, and when Margaret took her seat at the table, no one questioned her presence. She did not look for validation in their faces. She looked for alignment in their behavior. It was there, not perfect but present. Later that week, Margaret met once more with Attorney Collins to finalize the permanent structure of the Whitmore Community Scholarship Fund, ensuring that future applicants would benefit from a process rooted in fairness rather than proximity. The fund would carry Emily's inaugural award as its foundation, a testament to growth rather than conflict. As she signed the final documents, Margaret felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from acting in accordance with principle rather than impulse. That evening she returned home and placed the signed papers into her desk drawer beside the original trust agreement, the amended versions, and the letters that had followed. Each document represented a choice made without raised voices, without spectacle, and without surrendering dignity. She turned off the desk lamp and walked through her home, pausing briefly in the hallway where framed photographs lined the wall. There were images from years past, some containing absence, others containing reconciliation, all part of a longer story that could not be reduced to a single doorway or a single sentence spoken in haste. Margaret understood now that legacy is not defined by whether one is welcomed into a room, but by whether one maintains integrity upon leaving it. She stepped outside onto the porch as twilight settled across the neighborhood, the air mild, the sky streaked with fading gold, and allowed herself a steady breath. The doors in her life had not remained closed, they had simply required her to decide which ones deserved her presence. In that decision she found not victory but balance, and in balance she found peace.